The room was quiet. Too quiet, suffocatingly so. The silence was shattered by a tremor in her voice, one that no amount of composure could conceal. "I shouldn't have told you," she whispered, a confession that cut through the air like a razor. Her words hung, unspoken, as if the weight of what she had just said had locked her throat. The eyes of the room settled on her, yet she couldn't meet their gaze. She could feel their stares, piercing, expecting, demanding. She wanted to crawl into herself, but the truth, once let loose, could never be hidden again. "It was never supposed to come to this," she added, almost as an afterthought. There was no turning back now. The moment she had feared, the moment she had tried to prevent, had arrived. This wasn't just a conversation, it was the collapse of everything she had once held dear. The seconds ticked by in slow motion, and everything that had once felt safe shattered into pieces. Her voice faltered, the confession settling like a heavy stone in the room. "I shouldn't have told you," she whispered again, the words barely audible now. The space between them seemed to stretch, the walls closing in on her. They weren't angry, not yet, but there was a stillness, a silence that spoke volumes. In that moment, every question they hadn't asked seemed to crowd her mind, suffocating her. The truth she had so desperately tried to conceal now hung in the air like a noose. She could feel the judgment in their eyes, even if they said nothing. It wasn't just disappointment, it was deeper, more damning. She couldn't take it back, not now, not ever. And as she looked at them, all she could think was, "What have I done?" She could feel the air growing heavier with each second, each heartbeat. They hadn't said anything, but she knew what they were thinking. The silence was unbearable. It was the kind of silence that came before the storm, the kind that made her wish she could disappear. "I never wanted it to come to this," she whispered, but the words were hollow. There was no going back. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, a constant reminder of the time she had wasted, the time she had given away. She had tried to protect them, to shield them from the truth. But now it was too late. The lies she had lived by were crumbling, and there was no safe place left for her to hide. A faint rustling sound interrupted the silence, the soft scrape of a chair leg against the floor. The room felt as though it were closing in on her. Her breath came faster now, shallow and uneven. She couldn't remember when she had started to sweat, but it seemed like every part of her body was betraying her. "I didn't want to hurt you," she said, her voice cracking. "I never meant for any of this to happen." But the words felt like an apology that could never be enough. Nothing could undo what was done, and no amount of explanation could fix the damage she had caused. The air between them was thick with unsaid things, and every word she spoke only seemed to make the distance between them wider. She wanted to scream, to shout that it wasn't her fault, that she hadn't meant for any of it to happen. But the words wouldn't come. Her chest tightened, and she could feel the weight of the moment crushing her. She had never imagined it would end like this. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, don't look at me like that." But it was too late. The judgment in their eyes was already written, and no plea would change it. She had thought that telling the truth would set her free, but instead it had bound her to a reality she couldn't escape. The days blurred into one another as the weight of what had been revealed sank deeper into her chest. She didn't leave the house. Every corner seemed to suffocate her, the walls now pressing in with the truth she could no longer escape. It wasn't just the silence that haunted her. It was the absence of the life she once knew, the comfort of the lies she had held onto for so long. Each passing day felt like another nail in her coffin. Even the clock on the wall, once a benign observer of time, now felt like a ticking reminder of her guilt. She avoided the eyes of everyone around her, the shame an invisible cloak that clung to her skin, heavier than anything physical. Every room she entered felt foreign, and the space between her and the world outside seemed impossible to bridge. The silence screamed louder than any words could. She had once believed she could carry the burden alone, that she could isolate herself from the world, and the truth would stop chasing her. But that's not how guilt works. It consumes you from the inside, gnaws away at your sanity, until there is nothing left but the hollow ache of regret. The more she tried to push it away, the heavier it became. She couldn't even bring herself to look at her reflection in the mirror anymore. Who was she now? Was there any part of the person she had been before the confession left? The fragments of that life were slipping away, one by one, and she was powerless to hold on to them. She sat at the table, staring at the empty chair across from her, imagining the questions that would come, imagining the silence that followed her every move. The silence that had once felt comforting now felt like an insurmountable barrier. She could hear the murmurs of conversations happening around her, but none of it reached her. She was miles away, lost in a storm that no one else could see. The world continued on as it always had, oblivious to the turmoil that churned inside of her. It was as if she were both a part of it and yet completely disconnected. She longed for a moment of peace, for some kind of escape, but every door she tried to open led her right back to the truth she had tried to avoid. There was no escape. There was no peace. Only the relentless grip of regret, pulling her deeper into the abyss. She had no choice but to face it, but every fiber of her being screamed against it. It was late one evening when she felt it, the suffocating weight of everything she had tried to bury. She couldn't take it anymore. She stood up from the couch and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened street below. The air felt cold against her skin, and for a moment she wished she could escape, disappear into the night. But she couldn't. She was here, bound by her own actions. Her breath fogged up the glass as she stared out into the distance. The loneliness of it all was suffocating. She had pushed everyone away, convinced herself that she deserved to be alone, that the silence was a punishment she had earned. But the longer she stayed there, the more she realized that no matter how much she tried to run, she couldn't outrun the truth. It had already taken root inside her. The days blurred, each one an endless cycle of silence and self-inflicted punishment. She no longer tried to reach out to anyone. What was the point? She had ruined everything. Even her own reflection seemed unfamiliar to her now. She could hardly recognize the person she had become. Guilt had hollowed her out, leaving her with nothing but fragments of the life she once had. She had tried so hard to protect everyone, to shield them from the truth, but in doing so, she had destroyed everything. She had never meant for it to happen this way. She had always believed that she could fix things, that time would heal all wounds. But time was slipping away, and all that remained was the harsh reality that nothing would ever be the same again. The strain in the air had become unbearable, suffocating everyone around her. She had tried to avoid it for as long as she could, burying the truth, pretending it didn't exist. But now it was spilling over, its sharp edges cutting through every conversation, every glance. Every attempt to hide, to remain silent, only seemed to push them further away. It was no longer a matter of keeping the truth hidden. It was about the consequences of what had been said, what had been done. Her chest tightened as the realization set in. The people she cared about the most were slipping from her grasp, not because of the lies, but because of the silence. The trust that once bound them was now a fragile thread, fraying with every passing moment. And no matter how much she tried to fix it, the damage was done. They were no longer looking at her as they once did. She was a stranger in her own life. She could feel the pressure building, the cracks in her carefully constructed facade growing wider with each passing day. Every word spoken, every look exchanged, felt like a knife twisting deeper into her already bleeding heart. The silence between them had become so deafening that it was all she could hear. It was louder than any argument, heavier than any accusation. The things left unsaid seemed to scream in her mind, echoing endlessly. She wanted to explain, to apologize, to make it right, but the truth was no longer just hers to tell. It was tangled with the emotions of everyone around her, their hurt, their anger. She had made choices, and now those choices had set things in motion that she could not undo. The more she tried to fix things, the more the rift between them widened. They were slipping away, and no amount of words could bring them back. The truth had changed everything. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the lies had been a fragile cover, a mask that had protected everyone from the reality of her actions. Now that the mask was gone, there was nothing left to hide behind. She had expected the anger, the betrayal, but what she hadn't anticipated was the deep, suffocating silence. The silence spoke volumes, louder than anything else. It was a silence filled with unspoken accusations, with words that could never be said. She wanted to scream, to tell them everything, but there were no words that could undo what had been done. The guilt pressed down on her chest like a weight she could never escape. It was crushing her from the inside out, and she didn't know how much longer she could carry it. But she couldn't stop. The silence was only growing, and the longer it lasted, the harder it became to break through. The confrontation she had been dreading was inevitable. It wasn't a matter of if anymore, it was when. She could feel the eyes on her, the tension rising with every passing minute. She wanted to say something, anything, to break the unbearable quiet, but the words stuck in her throat. How could she explain the unexplainable? How could she make them understand? The lies had been easy to tell, the truth harder to bear. But now, there was no choice but to face it. She had told herself for so long that if she just kept quiet, everything would be okay, that it would all work out in time. But time had run out. The air was thick with unspoken emotions, and the weight of it all threatened to suffocate her. She couldn't hide anymore. She had to confront the very thing she had been running from. The truth was waiting, just on the other side of the silence. The moment of truth had arrived, and she could feel it vibrating through every fiber of her being. There was no turning back now. She had always known that it would come to this, that she would have to face the consequences of her actions, no matter how painful it would be. But now that it was here, she wasn't sure if she could bear it. She had spent so much time hiding from the truth, pretending it didn't exist, that now, standing on the precipice of it all, she felt completely exposed. The room was suffocating, the silence deafening, and all she could hear was her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She had no choice but to speak, to finally say the words that had been buried inside her for so long. But when the words came, they felt empty, hollow. No matter how hard she tried, they couldn't undo what had been done. It was too late for apologies. Too late for anything. It was the kind of revelation that split everything in two. The ground beneath her feet seemed to give way as the truth came rushing in, harder and faster than she had ever imagined. She had spent so long hiding from the reality of it, convincing herself that what she had done was inescapable. But the words that fell from their lips were something entirely different, something that shattered the narrative she had been so desperately clinging to. She was never missing, they said. We gave her away. It hit her like a bolt of lightning, leaving her speechless, frozen in place. For the first time, she realized she had been living in a lie that felt safer than the truth that was now unfolding before her. Her knees went weak, her vision blurred, and all she could think was, how could I have not known? The world had changed in an instant, and there was no going back. The revelation hung in the air like a weight too heavy to bear. She wanted to scream, to deny it, but the words lodged in her throat. She had always believed she was the one who had lost, the one who had been the victim of circumstance. But now, the truth unfurled before her. It was never a loss, it was a choice. I didn't lose her, I gave her away, they said. The words echoed in her mind over and over, each repetition digging deeper into her chest. She had never questioned it, never wondered if there was another side to the story. She had been so consumed by her own guilt and shame that she hadn't bothered to look closer. The lie she had believed for so long now felt like a cruel joke. She wasn't the one who had been betrayed. She had been the one who betrayed. And that truth, that unbearable truth, threatened to tear her apart. For a moment, everything went still. The silence that followed the revelation was suffocating, the kind of silence that feels like it's been stretched thin across a vast distance. She stood there, rooted to the spot, as the truth unfurled in front of her, its cold, hard edges cutting through the layers of denial she had built up. She thought back on all the times she had wondered, all the moments of doubt that had crossed her mind, but had been buried in the wake of her own justifications. But now there was no room for justification. There was no way to hide from it anymore. The truth was here, raw and unrelenting. She had been living a lie, and in doing so, she had caused more harm than she could have ever imagined. The weight of it was suffocating, and for the first time she could feel the walls closing in around her. She could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on her, even though they remained silent. They didn't need to say anything. The truth was there, hovering between them, hanging in the air like a cloud that refused to dissipate. It was as if they had all known, as if they had all been waiting for this moment, for her to finally see it. She had been too blinded by her own guilt to see it before. But now that the truth had come out, there was no going back. There were no apologies that could undo the harm she had caused, no words that could make it right. She had believed in her own version of the story for so long that she hadn't stopped to question it. But now, with the truth laid bare, she could see the reality for what it was, and it was far darker than she had ever imagined. The world she had built in her mind was crumbling, piece by piece. There was no redemption, no way to undo the damage she had caused. The truth was now a part of her, an indelible mark that she couldn't erase, no matter how hard she tried. She had spent so long running from it, hiding in the shadows, but the light had finally caught up to her, and she could no longer avoid the consequences of her actions. She had thought that if she kept her head down, if she didn't look too closely, everything would somehow work itself out. But now, in the cold light of day, she could see the full extent of the mess she had made. The lies had been easy to tell, easy to believe, but now that they had been exposed, there was no going back. She had to face what she had done, and the realization of that left her breathless, empty. There would be no happy ending, only the stark, painful truth. The moment had arrived. There was no turning back. She had lived in the shadows for so long, pretending that the truth could be avoided or hidden. But now, with everything hanging by the thinnest thread, the confrontation was inevitable. The silence between them was deafening, thicker than ever, and each passing second felt like an eternity. She could feel the pressure building in her chest, the weight of the words she had avoided for so long now threatening to spill from her lips. Her heart raced as she stood there, frozen, caught between the need to speak and the terror of the consequences. She had never imagined it would come to this. She thought she could control it, that if she kept quiet long enough, the storm would pass. But now the storm was here, and it was relentless. She had to face them, face what she had done, no matter how much it tore at her. The words came out in a rush, desperate and raw, like they had been building inside her for years, waiting for this very moment. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," she cried, her voice trembling. "I never meant for any of this to happen." But her words felt hollow, too empty to erase the damage she had caused. She had thought that keeping silent would protect them, that it would shield them from the consequences of her actions. But in the end, silence had only made it worse. The truth, no matter how painful, was something they all had to face. And now it was out there, no longer a secret, no longer something she could hide behind. The floodgates were open, and there was no going back. She had to own it. She had to face the devastation she had caused, no matter how impossible that seemed. The silence that followed her confession was more suffocating than any of the words she had spoken. The room seemed to close in around her, the weight of the moment unbearable. She could feel their eyes on her, too many eyes, too much judgment, too much pain. Every word that she had feared to speak had been let out, but it felt like nothing had changed. The walls between them were still there, still thick with anger and betrayal. She wanted to scream, to explain, to make them understand, but there was no way to undo the damage. What had been broken could never truly be fixed. And in that moment, she realized that the confrontation she had been avoiding wasn't just about them. It was about her too. She had to confront the truth within herself, the ugly, painful truth that she could no longer deny. It was time to face her own reflection. The words she had been so afraid of were out now, hanging in the air, but they felt like a poison she couldn't swallow. She had been prepared for anger, for resentment, But what she hadn't prepared for was the profound sense of loss that washed over her. The damage wasn't just in the things said, but in the things left unsaid, the trust, the innocence, the connection that had been severed beyond repair. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but the words felt inadequate, as if they could never make up for what had been destroyed. She had thought that by confessing, by admitting her mistakes, she could begin to heal. But the truth had come at too high a cost. The people she had cared about were slipping away, and no apology, no explanation, would bring them back. She could feel the distance between them, widening with every passing moment. The finality of it hit her all at once. There was no going back, no undoing what had been done. The moment had passed, and all she had left was the wreckage. She had thought that telling the truth would free her, but all it had done was expose the deep, unhealed wounds she had tried to bury. She could see the pain in their eyes, the disbelief that they would never truly understand. It was the end of something. She wasn't sure if it was the end of the relationship or just the end of the lie, but something within her had broken. And though she wanted to reach out, to beg for forgiveness, she knew deep down that the damage was beyond repair. The silence between them felt heavier than any apology she could offer. The walls had gone up, and she could feel them closing in around her. It was over. The silence felt suffocating, but it was no longer the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of acceptance. She had told the truth, and now the consequences were settled, lingering like smoke in the air. There was no going back to what had been, no reversing the clock, no returning to the people they once were. The weight of it pressed against her chest with each breath, but there was no fighting it anymore. She had been running from the truth for so long, and now that it had been exposed, there was nothing left to hide behind. The people she had once known, the relationships she had once cherished, they were all forever altered. There was no comfort, no reassurance. There was only clarity, harsh, painful clarity. She had destroyed something beautiful, and no amount of regret could undo it. The damage was done. She had to live with it, no matter how impossible it felt. The days that followed were a blur, each one slipping into the next with an unsettling sense of monotony. The world outside moved on, but she felt stuck, like she was standing in the ruins of her own making. The people she had once known so well were now strangers, their faces cold, their words distant. Every conversation felt forced, every interaction strained. She tried to carry on as if everything was normal, but nothing was. The weight of what she had done loomed over her, a constant reminder that she was no longer the person she had been. Her reflection in the mirror felt foreign, like she was staring at someone else, someone who had lost everything, and was still trying to piece herself together. She had made a choice, and that choice had brought her here. Now, all she could do was endure the consequences and try to find a way to move forward, even if she didn't know how. There were no more apologies left to give, no more explanations that could change anything. She had said her piece, and now all that remained was the quiet aftermath. She had wanted so badly to make things right, to fix the damage she had caused. But the truth was, it wasn't hers to fix. She had to accept that. She had to accept that there were some things beyond her control, some things that couldn't be undone, no matter how hard she tried. She had to face the reality that the people she had hurt might never forgive her, that the rift between them might never heal. The ache in her chest was constant, a painful reminder of what she had lost. But with that pain came an undeniable truth. She had done what she could. Now the only thing left to do was live with the consequences, no matter how much they weighed on her. In the end, there was no comfort, no reassuring words or soothing gestures. There was no happy ending, no final redemption. There was only the raw, undeniable truth of what had happened. The peace she had hoped for, so desperately, so naively, never came. Instead, she found herself surrounded by a silence that felt both suffocating and liberating at once. It was as if she had been stripped bare, and now, with nothing left to protect her, she was forced to confront the emptiness that remained. The relationships that had once defined her were gone, lost to the weight of her own choices. She had tried to shield others from the pain, but in doing so, She had created a world where everything she once held dear was fractured beyond repair. The only thing left to do now was accept the cost of the truth. As the days passed, she began to realize that no one was coming to fix things. No one was going to offer forgiveness or grace. The truth had been spoken, and now she had to live with it. She couldn't change what had happened, and she couldn't erase the past. What she had to do, what she had always needed to do, was move forward. She didn't know how. She didn't know if she ever would. But there was one thing she knew for certain. She had to try. She had to try to rebuild whatever she could from the rubble of her past. It wouldn't be easy. It might not even be possible. But in the end, she had to choose to survive, even if it meant living in the shadow of her mistakes. There was no other option. Not anymore. The air felt heavier now, as if time itself had taken a breath and held it, waiting for something. It had been days since the truth had come to light, and though she had walked through the motions of her life, there was a quiet stillness inside of her. The weight of her choices was unyielding, the echoes of what had been lost reverberating in every corner of her mind. She had thought she could outrun this, thought that if she just kept going, just kept breathing, things would eventually settle. But they hadn't. Nothing was the same. She had told the truth, but the cost of that truth was beyond her comprehension. She no longer recognized the person she had once been, nor the one she was becoming. In the silence, she heard the remnants of the past, a life she couldn't return to, and a future that was still uncertain. It was as if a part of her had died in the revelation of the truth. The person she had been, the one who had hidden behind lies and silence, was gone. What remained was a hollow version of herself, someone who had faced the consequences and now lived in the wreckage. But even in the midst of the ruin, there was a strange kind of clarity. She could see the truth for what it was now. It had taken everything from her, but in return, it had given her something else, a knowing, a brutal understanding of the cost of hiding. She could never return to the person she had been, but perhaps that wasn't entirely a loss. Perhaps in the end, this was the beginning of something new, something she would have to find for herself, piece by piece. As she walked through the quiet streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything she had known was slipping further away, like sand through her fingers. People passed her by, faces she didn't recognize, voices she couldn't hear. It was as if the world had moved on without her, leaving her stranded in a past she could never return to. She felt the finality of it all, the finality of her mistakes, the truth that could never be taken back. But in that finality, there was something else, something deep and hidden in the shadows of her grief. She wasn't sure what it was, but it was there, lurking in the background of her mind. Maybe it was hope, maybe just survival, but it was a flicker of something that wouldn't be snuffed out, no matter how dark the road ahead seemed. She stopped at a small, familiar corner. It was where she had once stood, laughing with people she had loved, before the world had changed. She hadn't realized until now how much she missed the simplicity of those days, the days before all the choices, the lies, the guilt. Now, it felt like that version of herself was a lifetime ago. She could almost hear their voices in the background, the hum of a life she no longer recognized. For a moment, she wished she could go back, to undo everything. But that was the curse of the truth. It leaves no room for rewrites. It simply is, and what was done can't be undone. In that painful knowing, however, there was peace. She had to keep moving, keep surviving. What had been lost would never return, but she would carry it forward with her, always. And as the night deepened, she felt something shift within her. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't redemption. But it was something else, a fragile, tentative understanding. She would never be the same. She could never go back to the life she had known. But that didn't mean she was lost. She still had time to rebuild, time to face the consequences of her actions, time to find a new way forward. It wouldn't be easy. There would be days when the weight of everything would threaten to crush her. But there would also be moments of clarity, of purpose, where she could see that she was still here, still breathing, still alive. In the end, that was all that mattered. She had survived. She would survive.